Sector 4, report status. We have negative contact.
Because that's exactly what I thought when I first heard about Vanessa Guillén, a 20-year-old U.S. Army soldier who vanished from one of the most secure military bases in America, Fort Hood, Texas. It's April 22, 2020. While the world is locked down from COVID, Vanessa's on duty inside Fort Hood's armory room, maintaining rifles, gear, and ammunition. At around 11:30 a.m., surveillance cameras capture her walking into the building, and then she just disappears. Hours later, her car's still parked outside. Her ID, wallet, and keys are found inside the armory. Her phone is discovered later, abandoned, and yet not one person saw her leave the building. The Army says little, no alerts, no search teams beyond the base, just quiet. Her mother, Gloria Guillen, knows something's wrong. She says, "My daughter would never just leave. She loved the Army." But when she asks Fort Hood what's happening, they suggest maybe Vanessa went AWOL. That word, AWOL, it would haunt her family for months. Because what really happened to Vanessa Guillén that day wasn't desertion. It was murder, hidden behind the walls of Fort Hood. And when the truth began to surface, it led straight to another soldier, one Vanessa worked with almost every day. It isn't who took her, it's how could anyone get away with it. Days passed after Vanessa Guillén vanished, and her family still had no answers. The Army kept saying they were searching, but the Guillens could feel it. Something was being hidden. That's when a name started floating through the base, Specialist Aaron David Robinson. Robinson was just 20, young, quiet, but with a reputation for anger. He worked in the same armory as Vanessa. He was also the last person known to have seen her alive. When investigators questioned him, Robinson said Vanessa left the armory around lunchtime, supposedly to meet someone in the parking lot. But there was a problem. No one ever saw her leave. There was no security footage, no car, no witness. Vanessa simply vanished into thin air from a building full of cameras. Investigators noticed Robinson acting strange. He was nervous, checking his phone constantly. When the family search made headlines, he told coworkers, "Man, I hope they find her soon," trying to sound casual, but he couldn't hide his panic. And then there was another name, a civilian woman, Cecily Aguilar, connected to Robinson through a string of late-night texts, a married woman, someone who shouldn't have been involved at all. The deeper investigators dug, the more Robinson's story began to unravel. His alibi didn't fit, his timeline didn't match, and every road was leading right back to him. But the truth wasn't going to come from Robinson, it was going to come from her, the woman who knew his darkest secret and who eventually couldn't keep it buried anymore. It turns into confession, and for investigators working Vanessa Guillén's disappearance, that moment came in late June 2020. For over 2 months, her family had been searching day and night. They stood outside Fort Hood with signs, went on national television, begged for answers. The Army said little, but the FBI and Texas Rangers were finally involved. When they reviewed cell phone data, one name kept reappearing: Cecily Aguilar, a 22-year-old civilian and the wife of another soldier. She'd been in constant contact with Aaron Robinson, the man last seen with Vanessa. Investigators brought Cecily in for questioning. At first, she lied, said she barely knew Robinson. But when confronted with messages showing dozens of calls between them on the night Vanessa vanished, she broke. The words spilled out fast, panicked, unbelievable. Robinson had confessed to her, she said. He'd killed Vanessa inside the armory. hit her with a hammer after an argument, then hid her body in a large Pelican storage box. That night he called Cecily for help. They drove 30 miles to a remote patch of land near the Leon River, hauling the box from his car. Cecily said they tried burning the body, then dismembered it and buried the remains in 3 shallow graves. It was horrifying, but her story matched phone tower data that placed Robinson at that exact spot on April 22. On June 30, 2020, search teams returned to the Leon River. A contractor smelled something foul and spotted disturbed soil. Within hours, investigators uncovered human remains. They were later confirmed to be Vanessa Guillén. But before police could arrest Robinson, he escaped. When they finally cornered him in Guillen, Texas, he pulled out a gun and ended his own life. Hook for next part. With Robinson dead and Cecily in custody, the Army could no longer hide. What came next exposed decades of silence, corruption, and a system built to protect itself, not its soldiers. Guillen. The nation's grief turned into outrage. The Army called it a tragedy. But for Vanessa's family, and for millions of others watching, it was proof that something inside Fort Hood was broken beyond repair. Gloria Guillen, Vanessa's mother, stood outside the gates of the base, holding her daughter's photo and shouting through tears, "The Army killed my girl." Her words hit harder than any press statement, because the truth was clear. Vanessa had been failed by the very institution she served. Within weeks, public pressure forced the Army to open an independent investigation, the Fort Hood Independent Review Committee. Civilian experts, prosecutors, and former military leaders began interviewing hundreds of soldiers. What they found was horrifying. Fort Hood had a culture of silence, intimidation, and neglect. Reports of sexual harassment were ignored or buried. Victims who came forward were often punished, transferred, or silenced. Commanders weren't protecting their soldiers, they were protecting their careers. The review uncovered that from 2015 to 2020, 151 soldiers at Fort Hood had died, murders, suicides, unexplained incidents. Many were never properly investigated. Vanessa's death was just one thread in a web of dysfunction and corruption that stretched deep into the chain of command. In December 2020, the Army released the report. 14 officers were fired or suspended. The findings were damning, but for the Guillen family, it wasn't justice. It was just acknowledgement. They wanted change, not apologies. So they took their fight to Washington, D.C., demanding new laws to protect service members. Their mission became a movement, the Am Vanessa Guillén Act, a reform that would forever change how the U.S. military handles sexual harassment and assault. But even as Congress took action, investigators uncovered something darker, proof that Vanessa's case wasn't an isolated tragedy, but part of a deadly pattern hidden inside Fort Hood's walls. Like a thread pulled from a uniform, one that revealed years of darkness hiding behind the Army's proud image. When the Fort Hood Independent Review findings became public, reporters started digging deeper. What they uncovered was shocking. Vanessa Guillén wasn't the first soldier to vanish under suspicious circumstances. She was one of many. In the 5 years before her murder, more than 150 soldiers had died at Fort Hood. Some were ruled suicides, others homicides. Dozens were labeled undetermined. And behind those statistics were families just like the Guillens, who said they'd been ignored, dismissed, or silenced by Army officials. One case, Private Gregory Morales, stood out. He'd been missing for nearly a year before Vanessa disappeared. The Army had declared him AWOL too, just another deserter. But after Vanessa's story exploded, search teams looking for her accidentally found Morales's remains, buried in a field just miles away from base housing. It was no coincidence. The discovery forced investigators to admit what many suspected. Fort Hood had been covering up negligence and failures for years. Morales's death had been written off to protect the base's statistics, just like others before him. And if Vanessa's case hadn't gone viral, his might have stayed hidden forever. The deeper journalists dug, the clearer the picture became. Fort Hood was one of the most dangerous military installations in the country. Between 2015 and 2020, soldiers stationed there were 2 times more likely to be murdered or sexually assaulted than anywhere else in the U.S. Army. This wasn't random, it was systemic, a culture of silence, fear of retaliation, leadership too afraid to face its own failures. But amid the outrage in congressional hearings, one question still haunted everyone. How did Aaron Robinson manage to kill Vanessa inside a weapons facility without anyone seeing or hearing a thing? The answer would reveal something chilling about that day. You have to picture that armory. The sterile smell of oil and metal, the echo of boots on concrete, racks of rifles lined in perfect order. It was a place meant for precision and discipline, not violence, not murder. On April 22, 2020, Vanessa arrived at work around 10 a.m. She was assigned to inventory and maintenance duty, routine tasks she'd done hundreds of times. Several soldiers saw her that morning. None noticed anything unusual. Around 11:30 a.m., she was inside the armory with specialist Aaron Robinson. No one else. According to investigators, they had a brief conversation, then it turned into an argument. Aguilar would later tell agents that Robinson confessed to her that Vanessa found out he was involved with a married soldier, Cecily Aguilar's sister-in-law. Vanessa reportedly said she planned to report him. What happened next was fast and brutal. Robinson grabbed a hammer, one of the heavy steel tools used for maintenance, and struck Vanessa several times on the head. She died instantly. The walls of that room were thick concrete. Soldiers worked in nearby bays with machinery and loud generators running. No one heard the attack. When Robinson realized what he'd done, panic took over. He cleaned the scene, stuffed her body into a Pelican weapons case, and dragged it outside. Cameras didn't capture him because that section of the lot was under maintenance, no active surveillance. Hours later, he drove the case off base, called Cecily Aguilar, and began the grisly cover-up that would haunt them both. For nearly 2 months, her family searched while Vanessa's body lay buried under Texas soil. When Aguilar finally confessed, her words exposed more than a crime. They revealed a chain of negligence so deep it made people question every layer of Fort Hood's command. Interrogation room. They already knew she was lying. They had her phone records, the texts, the GPS pings that placed her exactly where Vanessa's body was found. They just needed her to admit it. At first, Cecily tried to play it off. She said she and Robinson were just friends. She said she didn't know Vanessa. But the questions kept coming, sharper, faster, until her voice began to shake. Finally, she broke. "He told me," she whispered. "He told me he killed her." The room went still. Agents asked her to start from the beginning. Cecily described how Robinson had called her that April night, frantic, saying he'd messed up. When she met him near the Leon River, he opened the trunk of his car. Inside was a large, heavy case. The smell hit her first. She told agents how they tried burning the remains, how it didn't work, how Robinson forced her to help cut the body apart. It was gruesome, but Cecily didn't hold back. Maybe because after weeks of guilt, she wanted someone else to carry it. Her confession was detailed enough that investigators could retrace every step. When search teams returned to that same patch of land, everything she described was there. The burn site, the holes, the fragments of bone and fabric. The evidence was undeniable. And yet, for 2 months, Robinson had walked free on base, eating in the mess hall, sleeping in his quarters, as if nothing happened. Aguilar was charged with conspiracy and evidence tampering, facing decades in prison. But her story wasn't just about what she did. It was proof that the system around Robinson had failed. Because when investigators looked deeper, they discovered something horrifying. Vanessa wasn't the only woman to report harassment at Fort Hood, and most of those who did were ignored. Started to speak out. Their stories echoed the same pattern: harassment, retaliation, and fear. Fort Hood wasn't just a base, it was a system built to keep victims quiet. Investigators learned that Vanessa had confided in her family months before she disappeared. She told her mother she was being sexually harassed by a superior, but didn't feel safe reporting it. Her mother begged her to file a complaint, but Vanessa said, "They'll ruin my life, Mama. They'll make me regret it." Those words would haunt her family forever. After her death, soldiers began sharing their own experiences online under one phrase: #I Am Vanessa Guillén. Thousands of posts poured in, stories of women assaulted, threatened, ignored by leadership. For many, this was the first time they'd ever spoken publicly. The Fort Hood Independent Review Committee interviewed hundreds of these service members. The findings were chilling. Fort Hood's sexual harassment/assault response program had failed completely. Reports weren't investigated. Commanders dismissed claims as drama or misunderstandings. Victims were often labeled troublemakers, transferred, or forced to work alongside their abusers. The report called it a permissive environment for harassment and assault, a polite way of saying no one cared. And it wasn't just leadership ignoring the problem, it was the entire chain of command looking the other way. When the report was released in December 2020, it exposed decades of negligence. 14 high-ranking officers were fired or suspended, but the Army's apology felt hollow. It came too late for Vanessa and for countless others who'd suffered in silence. They weren't just demanding answers anymore. They were demanding reform, the kind of reform that could change the U.S. military forever. They traveled to Washington, D.C., standing on the steps of the Capitol with photos of Vanessa in uniform. Her mother, Gloria Guillen, spoke through tears. "My daughter wanted to protect this country, but the Army didn't protect her." Her words hit harder than any speech a politician could give. With the help of lawmakers and activists, the family introduced a bill, the I Am Vanessa Guillén Act. It aimed to break the chain of silence that had cost so many their safety, and in Vanessa's case, her life. The act proposed something revolutionary. Sexual harassment and assault cases would no longer be handled within the military's chain of command. Instead, they would go to independent prosecutors, outside the influence of commanding officers. Support poured in. Veterans, celebrities, and survivors across the country rallied behind the Guillens. Their fight became a movement, and that movement became impossible to ignore. In 2021, Congress passed major portions of the bill into law through the National Defense Authorization Act. For the first time in U.S. history, service members had the right to report harassment outside their command structure. It was a seismic change born from tragedy, and every person who signed that bill knew exactly whose name made it happen: Vanessa Guillén. But for her family, change didn't erase the pain. Gloria still visits Vanessa's grave, whispering prayers in Spanish, promising her daughter that her death was not in vain. Even with justice in motion, one question lingered in every corner of Fort Hood. How many more soldiers had suffered in silence, and how many never lived to tell their story? The name itself had become a symbol of betrayal, a reminder of what happens when silence is allowed to grow. The Army knew it couldn't move forward without change, real, visible change. In 2023, the base that once carried Fort Hood's name was officially renamed Fort Cavazos in honor of General Richard E. Cavazos, the first Hispanic four-star general in U.S. Army history. For many, the new name wasn't just symbolic, it was an act of acknowledgement, a promise that the military was trying to learn from its failures. But the scars ran deep. The Guillen family had filed multiple lawsuits against the U.S. government, claiming negligence and systemic failure. And they weren't alone. Dozens of families of soldiers lost at Fort Hood began demanding answers about their own cases. The base had become the epicenter of a long-overdue reckoning. Across the country, service members began receiving new training and resources under the laws inspired by the Am Vanessa Guillén Act. Investigations into harassment and assault were removed from local command and handed to independent prosecutors. For the first time, victims had a clear, protected path to report abuse. Vanessa's story had changed U.S. military law, a rare and powerful legacy born from unimaginable loss. Still, for her family, reform didn't fill the empty space at the dinner table or replace the laughter that used to echo through their Houston home. But knowing that her name could protect others, knowing that her courage had saved lives, that became their peace. Yet, even with progress made and laws changed, the Guillen family's journey wasn't over. Their fight had transformed the system, but the pain of what they'd lost would follow them forever, rebuilding from the ashes. When the cameras turned away and the protests quieted, they were left with the same empty chair, the same bedroom filled with medals and photos, and the same question: why did it have to be her? Gloria Guillen still visits Vanessa's grave every week. She kneels beside the white marble headstone, brushing dust away from her daughter's name. "Mija," she whispers in Spanish, "we did it. You changed the Army." Her tears fall, not from defeat, but from pride, because Vanessa's death had ignited something powerful, something that would outlive all of them. Her sisters, Myra and Lupe, kept pushing the mission forward. They launched foundations and campaigns to help soldiers report abuse safely. They became voices for those too afraid to speak. And when they tell Vanessa's story now, it's not just about tragedy, it's about transformation. The family also faced their own legal battles. They filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government, arguing that the Army's negligence and culture of cover-ups directly led to Vanessa's death. While the case moved slowly through the courts, their fight kept the issue alive in the media, reminding the world that accountability doesn't end with headlines. In 2022, Netflix released I Am Vanessa Guillén, a documentary that brought her story to millions worldwide. Viewers saw the humanity behind the uniform, the young woman who loved running, playing soccer, and dreaming about a life beyond Fort Hood. For the Guillens, seeing her face on screen was both painful and healing. It meant her voice would never fade. And as the years passed, one truth became clear. Vanessa's story wasn't just about injustice. It was about courage, unity, and a question that still echoes today. How many more voices will it take for silence to finally end? Of it. A young woman, loyal to her country, silenced by the very system she trusted to protect her. But what makes her story unforgettable isn't just the tragedy, it's the change her courage created. Because of Vanessa, the U.S. Army was forced to look in the mirror. Because of her, survivors of assault across the military finally had a voice that couldn't be buried under paperwork or fear. And because of her family's relentless love, what started as heartbreak became history. When soldiers now say, "I am Vanessa Guillén," they aren't just honoring her. They're declaring that they refuse to stay silent. They're demanding a world where uniforms don't hide abuse and ranks don't protect predators. That's her legacy. Fort Hood no longer carries its name, but its story carries a warning, a reminder that loyalty without accountability can be deadly. The culture that allowed Vanessa's death didn't form overnight, and it won't disappear easily. But every person who tells her story helps dismantle it piece by piece. In the end, Vanessa's story isn't just a true crime case. It's a mirror reflecting how easily justice can be ignored until someone refuses to back down. And that's what her family did. They refused to be quiet. They refused to let her memory be reduced to a headline. When people ask who Vanessa Guillén was, her mother answers softly, "She was a warrior. Even in death, she kept fighting. Her fight changed the law. Her name changed a base. And her story changed the country."